So thank you, everyone. Once again, it is so nice to be here and to share these teachings with you. It's a great honor and privilege, and like the opening of the sutra says, we're all in it together, all on our way to Buddha. So what I'd like to do today is I'm going to be speaking about chapter 24, and I'm going to divide the talk into three parts. First will be very short, just a summary of the Lotus Sutra to date. Not going into details, just giving people who may be tuning in for the first time some idea of where we are. Then I'm going to actually go through all of the points that I want to make about the chapter. So I'm sure I will finish that. And then I will go over the chapter in detail, and I will move through it according to time. So without further ado, we're in chapter 24 of the Lotus Sutra, and we have gone through quite a lot. The Lotus Sutra is something that just overturns and examines and breaks apart the earlier teachings, and then seems to put them together in many ways. So the main teaching that we learn about from the Lotus Sutra in the beginning is that there is one vehicle that will encompass all of the earlier teachings. It encompasses them, and it also surpasses them. And it's not entirely clear exactly how this works, because, well, what I believe and a lot of other people believe is that the Lotus Sutra's one vehicle is the mind itself, which cannot be pinned down and cannot be given any kind of boundaries, because it's boundless. It's non-dual. It is all pervasive. And that's what the Buddha is showing. And he's explaining that the profundity of the teachings, what he knows as a Buddha, simply cannot be imparted to us ordinary sentient beings, even to someone like Sariputra, the greatest arhat of wisdom. Even 100,000 Sariputras all combined wouldn't even be the teeniest bit of the Buddha's wisdom. So he has to use expedient means to communicate to us, and that comes in many different ways, and it's shown throughout the sutra. And we've learned about the great truth of the Lotus Sutra, that everyone, all of us, will become Buddhas. And even though the word Buddha nature is not used explicitly in the Lotus Sutra is filled with Buddha nature. That's from a practitioner's point of view. Scholars will, really nitpick a lot of things of what appears and what doesn't appear. And you're sort of, if you just listen to that point of view, it's very hard to put things together. And let's see. So, and then what happens, what I've just said is what really the teachings of the first part, the first 14 chapters of the Lotus Sutra. Then when we move into the second part of the Lotus Sutra, even the things that we were holding on to get sort of taken away from us. We find out that the Buddha that we have understood to have been born 2,500 years ago into the palace of a great king, that was not exactly true. Buddha has been a Buddha for countless eons. And the other part of the story, which has been so important for practitioners over the millennia, is that the Buddha gave the teachings and then he went into parinirvana. He disappeared. But that's also not true. The Buddha was using that as an expedient means, and we'll see that repeated in this chapter. And then once that's done, we get into what Thich Nhat Hanh calls the action part of the sutra. And that really begins in chapter 20 with Changbu Jing, never disparaging, who is an embodiment of Buddha nature. He is someone who shows us that we are ultimately worthy of receiving these teachings and embodying them ourselves. And we see the compassion of the medicine Buddha in the previous chapter in 23. And then we come to this chapter 24, which is called Wondrous Voice. And if you read a scholarly rendition of the chapter, it's pretty boring. I mean, it's just that there is this bodhisattva, wondrous sound, who visits the Shakyamuni with many bodhisattvas, learns some teachings, learns some samadhis, and returns to his world. In some renditions, or when they're giving a summary of the sutra, where some chapters will have a paragraph or two, there's very little given in this chapter. And I think this chapter is unbelievably meaningful and very moving and important. And that's really what I want to show here. So I want to just go over some of the things that I'll be covering when I do go over the sutra in more detail. One of the things that we're dealing with when we read the sutra is to understand that we first can encounter it on a literal level, like we would encounter Star Wars or the Game of Thrones or the Lord of the Rings. There's a narrative there with various characters in unfamiliar worlds, and this is something we have to assimilate to become informed by the form of the sutra. Then there's the metaphoric level, where it's pointing to deeper truths that we can understand on many levels, at least conceptually. And then there is the deepest level, the Li, from Dao Shan's commentary, which is the spiritual, the deepest meaning, which is really experienceable, but not conveyable, not really apprehensible from our senses. So we have to look at all these levels that are happening. When we do look at these levels, we can then look past what are the seeming contradictions that appear all throughout the Lotus Sutra, where the Buddha will say that the earlier teachings are somewhat invalid. They haven't gone far enough. And then in other parts, he'll say that those are the teachings that he teaches specifically when sentient beings need it. And one of the things that we'll see in the sutra that is happening is that bodhisattvas want to see the body of the Buddha. And in the Diamond Sutra, we learn that he who seeks me, the Shakyamuni talking about himself, he who seeks me in sight or sounds, his ways are perverted and he will not see the Tathagata. So we have to understand what seeing means in this case. It's quite different from trying to apprehend what the Buddha is, what the teachings are in normal concepts and forms. There's also a real history behind the Lotus Sutra, behind the teachings, which really comes out even from Hindu teachings of darshan, of actually seeing a deity, of actually becoming, and this you see in Vajrayana practice, where you not only see, but you are becoming what you are seeing. So you are embodying and becoming the teachings. That's really what's behind this seeing the Buddha. It's not just visuals that the bodhisattvas are looking for. And it also appears in the teaching history and the tradition. You'll see as the sutra opens, Wondrous Voice, and I'll say a little bit more about him in a moment, the main bodhisattva of this chapter wants to visit Shakyamuni, but he also wants to see a certain number of bodhisattvas. And the Avatamsaka Sutra precedes the Lotus Sutra, and that sutra is about the main bodhisattva visiting 53 teachers in order to complete his training. So there's an implication that it's not just that he wants to socialize, that he is really coming for something. And what he's coming for and the deeper meanings of the chapter are things that we can point to. And ultimately, we can be given the questions that we answer, that we can ask, and the need to, and we can see the need to investigate the deeper meanings of the sutra. So once again, the answers are found in the questions, in the persistence of answering the questions. This particular chapter, and actually all of the chapters, are showing the deepest kind of practice and awareness that exists in Buddha Dharma. That's why the Lotus Sutra is called sometimes the King of Sutras. It is embodying non-dual awareness. And that's an interesting thing to say, non-dual awareness, but the question of what it means and what it really means to experience it is something else. But the idea that there is this kind of teaching, which perhaps we don't quite understand now, is very important. So it will help us look past the particulars in the sutra, so we don't get lost in the narrative. And then there is really this question of what is the Lotus Sutra? Where is it? Why is it? People have remarked about how often through the sutra, it's actually 300 times, over 300 times, the Lotus Sutra mentions the Lotus Sutra. Now, the Lotus Sutra doesn't have an ego problem. There is no, it's not a being. But what it's pointing to is the fact, the spiritual fact, that the nature of our minds is non-arising. Nothing is conceptually happening the way we think it is. Yet everything is happening as we see it. It's a question of how we attach to these things. And so that's that's really at the deepest level. And of course, the other mission of the Lotus Sutra, the reason that it's mentioned so often, is that the Buddha states specifically in chapter 2 that his sole purpose for coming back to earth after he reached parinirvana, or seemingly reached pure parinirvana, is to save sentient beings. And the Lotus Sutra is in itself a launching pad for teachers. That is what it is trying to promote, as it asks us to receive, embrace it, read it, and copy it, and preach it. All of that is about the transformative nature of the Lotus Sutra. It's very important. And in that way, the whole sutra is kind of a mirror for us, just the way, like in the Rubin Museum where I work as a docent, we have many tankas and Buddhist paintings. One particular that many of you will probably know is the god of death, Yama, with a fierce grimace on his face, holding the entirety of the 12 links of dependent origination and the 6 realms of existence and the workings of karma. And that is the saha world, the world of endurance that we're stuck in. And the idea of a painting like that is you look at it and you see yourself in a way, you see where you are. And that's what the Lotus Sutra, and actually all sutras, in a sense, all sutras they're all one, but that's what sutras help us to do, to see where we are, to look at us, to look at ourselves as we are now, and as we are implicitly, inherently, intrinsically as Buddhas. So there are these deep questions that we can look beyond the way we would normally just read the sutra as we're lying back. And when I use these examples of Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, in one sense, I'm not kidding. It's you can just read the sutra as if it's some sort of story, and it's some narrative that has nothing to do with you. But that is really what's not going on. but it is something that really does happen as you start to become aware, as you start to become exposed to the sutra and immerse yourself in it. So, and indeed we can recognize our Buddha nature. And then another thing that I really want to emphasize in this talk is that the things that are going on in this chapter, bodhisattvas in worlds beyond worlds, like in galaxies far away and long ago or long in the future, seemingly so far removed from us and almost unrelatable. That's not the case. This sutra and this chapter in specific really talks to us, to me. I've really found that the questions in this are really relevant to things that are going on in our world today. All of the global warming issues, political polarization, and pollution, and nuclear disarmament, and a lot of things that are giving people enormous amounts of anxiety. Those are addressed in a way, or they can be addressed in the way that you can see that the sutra is really promoting clarity of mind, really seeing things as they are and not getting attached to the content of what we are encountering, not ignoring the content at all, but being able to approach it. Later on the sutra, in this chapter, it says to give sentient beings what they need to know, appropriate knowledge. And that appropriate knowledge is knowledge, insight, which is clear, non-self, not pure, not impure, it does not increase or decrease. It is really things at the way they are. And that's what's in this chapter. So it really bears paying attention to. And I also had this thought about how many of us can't even relate to this idea of actually seeing a Buddha. But there are many Buddhas in our lives, right? And of course, the teaching says that everyone we encounter is a Buddha, which first is a very nice conceptual idea. And I think it becomes more of a reality when you look deeper. But I was just thinking about Master Sheng Yen, who was one of the most remarkable people I ever met, who I got to know somewhat, quite well. I spent much time with him. And there's somebody who led by example. And we can see that happening all around us. And I often tell this story of how on one retreat I was very sick, and it was 2 in the morning and I was coughing, and I opened my eyes and there was Shifu putting medicine in my mouth. And that is a metaphor for the teachings as medicine, for our afflictions. And that's what we're encountering. So when I recite those opening lines for the chapter, I'm not just whistling Dixie. I mean, this is really what's going on. So, and the other thing to also look out for in the sutra, and this is something that Shifu in his book about the Lotus Sutra points out. We'll see as we go through the sutra that wondrous voice acquires a particular type of samadhi. And, once again, what we make of what that means, it's kind of a supernatural power, but he has this ability to transform into anyone at any time for the reason of saving sentient beings. And, we have a very materialistic view of the world. And when we hear things like that, we sort of say, oh, what a cool power. I could impress my friends, if I could just be anyone that I wanted. And this is it has utterly nothing to do with what's going on in the sutra, because everything that the bodhisattvas are doing is not for their selves or their own aggrandizement, it's for helping sentient beings. However, like anything else, something like that can be misused. And Shifu points out that some people then claim to be anointed Bodhisattva, wondrous voice, that they are the ones who have come, who are saving sentient beings, and then they use this as kind of a con game to manipulate people, and they can cause a lot of harm. Right. So we really have to be careful about how we encounter these teachings and how we interpret it, and we have to be aware that we are interpreting it. And until Buddhahood, I guess we'll interpret it some way. And then it's another very important point about this, the accessibility and the humanness of this sutra, and especially this chapter, is we can get very misguided and misled by this idea that these are these incredible beings with these astonishing powers, and they're just so far beyond us. But if you really read this chapter carefully, you'll see that Wondrous Voice is making these visitations because there's something that he's missing. He's not a Buddha yet. He has to acquire more teachings. And one thing that you hear in this and other sutras quite often is how a particular bodhisattva has made offerings to countless Buddhas, and that's all in the service of removing the obfuscations, the veil of ignorance that covers our eyes, and it can be very thick and it can be very subtle. And so they're not that different from us. And of course, that is really what the teaching says. We're not that different from them, and they're not that different from us. So we can look for that as we go through the sutra. And now I just want to go over the persona, the beings that you'll meet in the sutra, so that you're clear on it when we go over in more detail. There's, of course, Shakyamuni, who needs no introduction. And then the next being is Pure Flower Constellation King Wisdom Tathagata, right? Who is the Buddha in the land where Wondrous Voice actually lives. And so his name in Sanskrit is Kamala Dala Vimala Vimalana Kshatra Raja Sam Kusi Mita Bijna. Try saying that backwards. And it's much simpler in Chinese. Jinghua Suwang Jurulai, right? So that's, and then we will encounter Wondrous Voice, Miao Yin Pusa. And interestingly enough, the yin, which means voice or sound, has been translated many different ways. Could be fine sounds, wonderful sounds, wonderful tones, but actually yin can also mean the teachings themselves, I believe. So I've decided that I use Wondrous Voice because this is the voice of the Dharma, not an individual. Right? It's very clear, important to see that clearly. It's the voice of the Dharma reaching us. And then when the Buddha gives a kind of historical background to a Wonderful Voice, then he talks about another Buddha, which is the Buddha, Cloud Thunder Sound King. And I'm not going to pronounce his name in Sanskrit. And then, of course, there's many treasures, Dwabao, Rulai, Prabhuta Ratna, who, give this information now, who appeared in the 11th chapter of the sutra, and in a great stupa, and he appears whenever the Lotus Sutra is preached. And he, representing the ancient tradition, Thich Nhat Hanh might call the universal, and then he is seated in that stupa with Shakyamuni, who represents the historical. So we've got the universal and the historical, or the absolute and the relative, and those combined make up that. That is what non-dualism means. And then there's one character briefly mentioned, Narayana, who's really kind of a Hindu deity and just represents great strength and fortitude. It's kind of like a Hercules. So now we're ready to talk about the sutra. I'll go over it as quickly as I can, see where we get. So I talked about non-dualism. So one thing that happens is non-dualism, and we're outside of space and time, right? Because it says Ursher at that time when this chapter opens. What time is that? Is it the past? Is it the future? Is it the present? It's all three and none of the above. It's right at this moment. So, and once again, my feeling about this in all sutras is that they are transpiring right now. The message is alive in this moment, and that's what we are encountering when we hear Dharma talks. So the Buddha emits rays of light from his top knot, his Ushnisha, so Roji, his meat top knot in Chinese, which I don't have. See, no top knot, and also from his Urna, from the tuft of hair between his eyebrows. And this is the first time this has happened in the sutra. It's not the first time that the light has been emitted. As a matter of fact, that's how the sutra opens. And this is one thing very unusual about the Lotus Sutra, where sutras often begin with questions. This sutra begins with a statement, which is the emission of light. And some people have noted that the Lotus Sutra is famous for announcing a teaching which it never gives. And I think that the whole sutra is the teaching, and it's stated as it is because of expedient means. And the teaching is given in that the emission of light, but of course we can't understand that, but we can understand a lot of the other things that happen. And we keep all of this in mind. We can sort of do that as we question and look deeper. So in this particular case, for the first and only time in the sutra, light is emitted from two places simultaneously. And you could say that one is compassion, one is wisdom, one is the absolute, one is the relative. What happens is the lights merge. So it's symbolic of non-dualistic awareness. And then this is transmitted through 108 millions and billions of worlds. And somehow it seems to stop there, but in the sutra, and I'm just reading this very carefully, and nonetheless, in this land called Adorned with Light, there is the Buddha, Pure Flower Constellation King Wisdom, who is preaching the Dharma, and a bodhisattva under him, namely Wondrous Voice, he's illuminated by this light. And then we rather than just sitting back and saying, oh, that's nice, this kind of happened, we can sort of ask why is this happening? And the Buddha is, just like throughout the whole sutra, he is sharing his teachings in the deepest way, and showing the illumination of the teachings beyond us ordinary sentient beings, but not beyond the great bodhisattva like Wondrous Voice, whose body is illuminated, and he gets a message. Now that isn't stated in the sutra, but it has to be, because somehow this experience prompts him to go visit Shakyamuni. And he And then his bona fides, if you will, are given. I think this is very important. There are 16 samadhis that he has achieved. And I'm not going to go into the details, but one, he has the ability to understand the language of any living being and many other things like this. And once again, we look at this as in a greedy way. I think, wow, wouldn't that be cool to be able to do that? Once again, it's not about that. And the other thing, by the way, just to mention about the emission of light, we who usually react to the world in terms of comparisons and labels and measurement, think that the Buddha was right where he was, and then the light was sent somewhere else. So he's sitting here and the light is there. But I think the deeper teaching is that the Dharmakaya, the Buddha's nature, is everywhere. His body, which we perceive, of course, conceptually, is in the light, and the light is in the body. We tend to make these distinctions, but these distinctions don't really exist. So here when we get back to Wondrous Voice, he's got all of these samadhi powers, and in one sense, we could be wowed by that, but as I said earlier, he needs something. He is incomplete. He's going to visit Shakyamuni for a purpose. And not only is he going to visit Shakyamuni, but he's going to see Manjushri, Medicine King Bodhisattva, Brave Donor Bodhisattva, Constellation King Flower Bodhisattva, Superior Conduct Bodhisattva, King Dormant Bodhisattva, and a bodhisattva beyond medicine, which could be Medicine King is the one who carries the medicine around his pouch, and Shang Yao is the one who is the medicine. And all of these bodhisattvas have particular attainments, if you will, that Wondrous Voice wants to learn from. So that then happens. So then this is really interesting to make the point of how this sutra and this chapter are not far from us, are not something we cannot relate to. The Buddha of that land adorned with pure light tells Wondrous Voice before he makes his journey to our Saha world. He says, don't despise this world. These this world is that you're going to. It's rocky. It's filthy. It's filled with evil and pollution. And the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas there are puny, right? Whereas you, Wondrous Voice, and I translated this into miles, more interesting. His body is 336,000 miles high. Try and imagine that. And the Buddha himself, pure flower, is his body is 54 million miles high. And that's it's stated in yojanas, but I think the miles kind of hit us a little bit harder. So then what Wondrous Voice does is, the power of his samadhi, which is quite great, he causes 84,000 lotuses to appear in the Saha world, which is noticed by Manjushri, first of all, and of course the Buddha knows. So, now one thing, here's a little aside about the flowers, and remember, the Lotus Sutra is the Fa Hua Jing, right? The Dharma Flower Sutra, and one of the translators of the Lotus Sutra, Jean Reeves, points out that word flower can really be understood as a verb, as flowering. That the sutra is flowering, we are flowering as incipient Buddhas. So there's a great deal of meaning in that. Also, it's hard sometimes I think one can go overboard in the numbers in the Lotus Sutra. Sometimes they're absolutely incomprehensible and stated as such, incalculable. But other times, I think it's kind of interesting that he sends 84,000 lotus flowers, and 84,000 is often the word that's used to talk about all of our afflictions. And this is, to me, a subtle message of how the practice is transformative, that our afflictions can be turned into wisdom states. And I think that's very important to note. Plus, they're not regular lotus flowers. They're made. They have golden petals and silver stems, and every part of them is bejeweled. So they're kind of supernatural flowers. And then the interesting thing about it is that Manjushri describes the flowers exactly as they were created, transmitted by wondrous voice. And I realized if I were sitting there, I would say, oh, look up, wow, I don't, are those daisies? Are those, I don't, look like there are these flowers in the sky. But Manjushri, with this crystalline awareness, states exactly the way the flowers were when wondrous voice transmitted them, for lack of a better word. And that is kind of a transmission in and of itself, I think, on a subtle level. So, and then also with the metaphor of the flower, it might be 84,000 when they were sent by wondrous voice, but when they arrive, when they are observed in the Saha world, they become tens of millions of flowers. So one might think that there's kind of a typo in the sutra, or it's a deeper meaning that this is the nature of what flowers do. They grow, and they produce seeds, and they produce other flowers. And and there's, I think, some harking back even with the name of the whole sutra, Fa Hua Jing, to the central story of Chan, with Mahakashapa being the only one who understood, right? Because there was that kind of mind-to-mind transmission. There was this this understanding that everything is contained in this. I mean, that's another talk in and of itself. But I think a lot of this underlies what's going on in the sutra. So Manjushri asked the Buddha, what's going on? So Manjushri doesn't know kind of how it happened. He sees it very clearly. Now, the Buddha, of course, who is omniscient, knows exactly what's happened, and he knows why it's happened. And he says to Manjushri that wonderful voice Bodhisattva approaches me in reverence, wishing to make offerings and to hear the Lotus Sutra. And so the Buddha already understands that. And that is, that's giving us the reason that that this is transpired, at least on the surface. At least we're starting to understand what's going on. And then then Manjushri talks about all of these lotuses that have happened, and then he starts to look deeper, which is what the sutra is always asking us to do. It's like, okay, there's this great display, it's almost like the Wizard of Oz. I see all these things there, but what's going on? What's happening behind the curtain? Man, what's going on making all of these things happen? And what he wants to know is about the wholesome roots that Wondrous Voice has accumulated and developed, and the merit that he's cultivated, and the supernatural powers, his ability to concentrate. And so, this question is really at the heart of the chapter. And it's not, it's answered and it's not answered. within the chapter in a way, because the deepest meaning of what's going on in the chapter is an experience that can be pointed to, but not conveyed directly. So this is the thing that that's very close to what Subhuti asked in the Diamond Sutra. How should we bodhisattvas comport ourselves, and how should we control our minds? It's a central question of how we can move towards liberation and save sentient beings. It's beyond all the bells and whistles. These are the deepest questions. And this is what Manjushri wants to know. Once again, not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. And so, and what he wants to know the name of the samadhi, which is obviously it's deeper than a name, but he wants to understand all the workings of it so that he can practice it and then see wondrous voice's physical marks, his majestic posture and his comings and goings. And once again, seeing here is much deeper than surface seeing. This is really about embodiment, about becoming, right? And one of the meanings of one of the ways that meditation is described in Sanskrit is bhavana, which is becoming. That's what meditation is, and that's what's happening throughout the sutra, and what's happening with us. We're continually becoming, continually changing. Now, interestingly enough, my wondrous voice wants to see, or actually Manjushri wants to see wondrous voice, and the Buddha says that Prabhuta Ratna will introduce you. And this once again is authenticating the lineage of the sutra and showing the timelessness, the non-duality, and a number of things to clue us in. This is not simply a meeting, a meet and greet kind of thing. There's much more going on. And so on his way, wonderful voice passes through many worlds, which quake in 6 different ways as he passes. Once again, the number 6 sounds like it harkens to the 6 paramitas, that he is someone who has mostly accomplished all 6 of these teachings, which bodhisattvas have to master. And once again, just quickly of generosity and of comportment and of patience and of perseverance and meditative accomplishment, wisdom. These things are emblematic of the bodhisattva. And so wondrous voice arrives. Also, interestingly enough, musical instruments have play at various times within this sutra, and at one point they are playing by themselves. And to me, also, this is kind of a symbolic representation of non-duality. There's no one striking the instruments. The instruments give off music by themselves. So, and one of the things that we see in that's happening in the receiving of these teachings is that there's no receiver, there's nothing received, and there's no interchange. Everything is empty. This is also deeply implied in the sutra. So when wonderful voice arrives, and I don't know how, I'm assuming he was able to shrink his body from 336,000 miles high so that he could talk more easily to the Buddhas and the bodhisattvas there. He arrives at a platform that is 7 tall trees high, and then he descends. And once again, in terms of the humanness, by the way, to go back about what the Pure Flower Buddha was advising, a wonderful voice about don't despise the people in the Saha world. We might ask, well, why would a great bodhisattva need to be told that? I mean, we have enough problems with our prejudice and biases. We would think that someone at that level, very high in the eighth bhumi and above, wouldn't need to be told that. But there's still obfuscation, and I think the Buddha is explaining that to us. And also, this sutra is meant to be witnessed and practiced by a sentient being. So it's kind of a heads up to us that we ought not to look down on ourselves that much or other people, because it's a natural tendency that comes into mind. And Shakyamuni is Pure Flower is pointing that out. And then another part of the humanness, which really is demonstrated here and elsewhere in the sutra, is when Wondrous Voice comes and talks to Shakyamuni, he conveys Pure Flower Buddha's best wishes, and he asks, "How are you? Are you worried? Are you being able to deal with life as it comes to you? And are your four elements harmonized? Can you endure the world's affairs? Is it easy to save sentient beings?" And then he says, "Are they not excessive in greed, anger, stupidity, jealousy, stinginess, and arrogance?" Right. Well, which is, in a way, he's kind of disobeying what Pure Flower Buddha said to him by asking about this. And are they not filio? Do they disrespect shramanas? Do they have heterodox views? Do they fail to control their emotions? Can they overcome Mara, the devils within them? And interestingly enough, he asked those questions. Shakyamuni does not reply to them. So they're kind of addressed to us in a certain way, or perhaps Wondrous Voice gets the answer in another way that's not described in the sutra. And so then a Wondrous Voice also asks about Prabhutarata, many treasures. Once again, is he tranquil and at ease, few worries? And this also shows how even at this level, which is kind of beyond our comprehension, there is a great amount of care and respect that is shown from one Buddha to the other. There's no arrogance. There's no sense of separation or of hierarchy, and that's quite wonderful. And then Shakyamuni says to many treasures Buddha, that Wonderful Voice would like to see him. And Many Treasures says, "Excellent, excellent. You will have you're able to make offerings to Shakyamuni, listen to the Lotus Sutra, and see Manjushri and others." And that's really interesting, because it seems that Wonderful Voice has been teaching the sutra, yet he still has to listen to it. And that's also a heads up to us in terms of how persevering we have to be in our practice. And it's also kind of replicating what happened in chapter 11 with the great treasure stupa that rose in the air. And so that now a new bodhisattva comes into the chapter. This is Flower Virtue. And he asked the Buddha, what good roots has Wonderful Voice planted and benefits and cultivated, and how has he cultivated them in order to attain his supernatural? Same sort of question. So the sutra is really emphasized this. And just looking at the time. Then the Buddha gives the history of Wondrous Voice Bodhisattva, basically saying that he was in another land with the Buddha Cloud Thunder Sound King. And he made offerings with his musical instruments, and he gave 84,000 alms bowls in terms of as a symbol of his devotion and the dissemination of the Dharma. So it's not, once again, from a department store. It's the bowls are representative of so much of the dissemination of the teaching, of the spreading of the Dharma. This is really important to see. But as a result of his perseverance and his practice, he acquired these supernatural powers. And then there's a really interesting thing here where the Buddha says to Flower Virtue, what do you think? Who do you think this wondrous voice is? And we would be prepared from having read this sutra earlier, especially like in the first chapter, where it's revealed that Maitreya, who's just a bodhisattva in the first chapter, was a bodhisattva in a past life named Fame Seeker, who was really kind of arrogant and in it for himself. Yet he had planted good roots and done all the things that are talked about in this chapter. And now he is Maitreya, and then the prophecy of Maitreya as the future Buddha is given in that chapter. So we're all ready to hear that this wondrous voice is someone else. But what the Buddha says is wondrous voice is wondrous voice. I'm not repeating myself. That's what the sutra says. This wondrous voice that you said that was there with the musical instruments and the alms bowls, that's the same wondrous voice that's standing right in front of you. So it's kind of an integration into his own personality in a way. It's kind of the self confronting the self and dissolving within the self. It's a very interesting thing. There's further contemplation about this chapter. Then another kind of key thing in this sutra occurs, which is the Buddha tells Flower Virtue, well, look, you see this one bodhisattva in front of you, but that is not the whole story, because of the power that this bodhisattva has. And this is worth reading. I'm going to read this paragraph. This is Burton Watson translation. And this is worth reading. So, but this bodhisattva manifests himself in various different bodies and preaches this sutra for the sake of living beings in various different places. At times he appears as King Brahma, at times as the Lord Chakra, at times as the heavenly being Freedom, at times as the heavenly being Great Freedom, at times as a great general of heaven, at times as the heavenly king Vaishravana, at times as a wheel-turning sage king, at times as one of the petty kings, at times as a rich man, at times as a householder, at times as a chief minister, at times as a Brahmin, at times as a monk, a nun, a layman believer, or a lay woman believer, at times as the wife of a rich man or a householder, at times as the wife of a chief minister, at times as the wife of a Brahmin, at times as a young boy or a young girl, at times as a heavenly being, a dragon, a yaksha, a Gandharva, and a Shura, a Garuda, a Kamnara, a Maharaga, a human or a non-human, and so preaches the sutra. The hell dwellers, hungry spirits, beasts, and the numerous others who are in difficult circumstances are thus all able to be saved. And for the sake of those who are in the women's quarters of the royal palace, he changes himself into a woman's form and preaches this sutra. So in other words, wondrous voice can transform into anyone. And this harkens back to what I was talking about earlier, how people can misuse this understanding. You can use it of course, in a much healthier dharmic way, in realizing that anyone around you could be the bodhisattva, and so you further reason to treat people with reverence and respect, and to see them as yourself. So that is wondrous virtue's power, and when you think about it, he can also, in the next paragraph, he can also turn himself into all of the different kinds of practitioners, whether it was a Shravaka, practitioner of the early teachings of the Buddha, a Prateka Buddha, which John clearly translates as someone who is illumined by observing causes and conditions, which I think is pretty interesting because Prateka Buddha is often this kind of unrelatable figure. But in this way, you can think that, we can often meet people who are metaphorically Prateka Buddhas, who are wrapped up in themselves. So I think it's a nice metaphor. And of course, he can appear as a bodhisattva or as a Buddha, and he can also appear to go into parinirvana. Once again, if that is what it takes to save a sentient being. And then you start to get the feeling that even though this bodhisattva is called Wondrous Voice, you can see that he's many more things. And actually, he could indeed be Manjushri, who he's come to see in part. Manjushri was very interested in meeting him because Manjushri is also known as a bodhisattva of pure voice. And then once again, with the way that we often relate to sutras, we want to classify things. When we accomplish something, we want to get credit for it. We don't want the other person to get credit for it. We really want to distinguish who people are. We want to know what their powers are. I remember when my daughter was 2 years old, I'd read stories to her. She would say, "Is he good or bad?" Right? We really want to know that. And I think these boundaries that we normally work within are simply they're boundaries of our Saha world. They're boundaries of that are dualistic. The sutra is really breaking apart all of these things. And then the question is this: well, how did he do this? And what the Wondrous Voice has accomplished is he has acquired the samadhi of manifesting in all forms. And this is in Chinese, this is Qi Sanwei Mingxian Yiche Se Shen. And nobody can really translate this. That gives you an idea. So it's observation of all forms, manifesting all kinds of bodies, from various translators, manifestation of the body of all forms, the concentration in which one can take on any form, the contemplation in name, revelation of all forms, manifesting all physical forms, etc. So, and once again, this is the kind of thing, we really want to know. And what is really being described here is really Prajna Paramita. We're really in the territory of the Heart Sutra by the end of this chapter. I mean, the whole sutra, of course, is in that. So everything has been taken apart, right? So one of the ways that conditioned things are recognizable, and this is from the Pali Canon, is you can see something has an arising, an enduring, a transformation, and a ceasing. That tells you that something is conditioned, tells you something is illusory, it's impermanent. If something cannot be observed like that, then it's unconditioned. Then it's in, it's non-dual. It's in the at the level of the deepest wisdom. So that's kind of where we're left. And then what happens is Bodhisattva, wonderful sound, goes back to Pure Flower Buddha and reports and says, I did exactly what I said I was going to do. And the 84,000 bodhisattvas that traveled with me also achieved this samadhi. And then 42,000, sometimes it's translated as sons of gods, achieved the the samadhi of persevering, the patience to see that the mind is not arising. This is of the 8th bhumi. Right? So a lot has been accomplished, and flower virtue, the bodhisattva who was listening to all of this, he actually attains the Dharma flower samadhi, which may be that he's now totally qualified to teach the Lotus Sutra. So this has been a fairly quick tour of this chapter, and I hope I've been able to convey my enthusiasm and my awe about what's going on in this chapter and what it shows us. It's really astonishing. And so I will just give the closing liturgy for the sutra, and then if we have time for questions. So may the virtuous merits adorn and purify the pure land of the Buddhas. Upwardly, we repay the 4 layers of gratitude. Downwardly, we alleviate the suffering of the 3 destinies. May those who see and hear the Dharma generate Bodhi mind, exhausting this body of retribution. May we be reborn in the land of extreme bliss. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Now, I guess we can still, if anyone have questions, it's a little past 12, but yeah, if no one has questions, I guess.
Sorry, this is Changhua. Can I ask a question?
Oh, sure, Changhua, please.
Okay, so in this chapter, when the samadhi is called manifesting all kinds of bodies.
Right.
Do you recall that this samadhi described anywhere that how to practice it?
Well, how to practice it? Well, first of all, if I could practice it right now, I would turn myself into someone entirely different. I think that it is when the mind of pure clarity is achieved, and you're no longer holding on to the 5 skandhas. That's why I brought up prajna paramita. Maybe that's how I do, but I'm, this is sort of above my pay level.
Yeah, because I remember some chapter mentioned about it's a 普现色身如来. 普现色身. I remember there's a teacher talk about that the whole practice part of this Lotus Sutra is about this samadhi, and then so we have a liturgy about Lotus repentance of the samadhi of anyway. This is a repentance liturgy that do the repentance and then practice the Lotus Samadhi. And then the Lotus Samadhi, according to a professor's study, it's about this samadhi of manifesting all kinds of bodies. So I was discussing this with Guo Kai Fast because she's expert on Lotus Sutra and the repentance of Lotus Sutra, and so we will discussing about how to practice this samadhi, and then she just told me that it's silent illumination.
Yes, yeah, I think that is, yeah, that's also my understanding. It's a very advanced silent illumination. Your mind is not wandering at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that I wanted to show is even these great bodhisattvas, still need something. There's still something missing. There's something separating them from whatever bhumi they're on in Buddhahood. And as I said, it's very encouraging to us sentient beings to realize that people who we think are very accomplished, and of course they certainly are very accomplished, but just like them, we have further to go. Shifu always would say he'd get some kind of revelation, attainment, and he would say, "This is not my destination."
Yeah. Thank you for your talk.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you. Thank everybody. So it was really nice for you all to come, and really this is just a wonderful opportunity. So thank you all again.